All right, welcome back everyone. My name is Miles Huff and I'll be moderating today's panel on building an accessible and inclusive workplace. I know that we are right after lunch. We're gonna do everything we can to keep you awake, and thank you for joining us, whether it be here in person or virtually. So I'm honored to share the stage today with three amazing leaders who are living and working in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility space. And for the first, this is one of the first panels I've been on where I'm the only male on the stage. This is fantastic. But it's also just, I think, a testament to how hard Signal Centers tries to set these things up and be diverse and inclusive, and we're all excited to be here. So let's take a moment to have our panelists introduce themselves. Caitlin, I feel like you might be at a disadvantage because we just watched a video about you, but we would love to hear more about you, where you work, and your connection to the work.
Absolutely. So, hello, my name is Caitlin Edge. I am a senior digital accessibility analyst at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee. I'm only very recently in this role. However, I have been working at Blue Cross and in accessibility for around 2 years now. I am deeply connected to this line of work, primarily because of my visual disability. Diversity and inclusion has always been a passion of mine. However, accessibility really came into the picture as a necessity because as I said in the video, I lost my vision when I was around 20, and it's been a gradual process from there. However, learning to navigate the world learning to navigate like an inaccessible world has been a real struggle, and it's brought me to be very passionate in accessibility, both in a digital space like I work at Blue Cross, and also in a physical space like I live in the world.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. And we're gonna talk more about your personal experience in a second. I'm excited, thank you. Kim.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Appledorn. I am a talent development specialist at EPB. I've been with EPB for 7 years now. I work in inclusion and diversity, so I'm very passionate about the work professionally, but also personally, being an ally and an advocate and a member of diverse communities myself.
Thank you, Kim. And Ashley.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ashley Floyd. I'm a senior contracts manager at the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I also serve as the champion of our Abled Employee Resource Group. So I've been at TVA about 10 years, and around 2015, we really put a focus on inclusion with diversity, and I just felt a calling to it. They were asking for volunteers, and it was something that me personally, having a lot of diversity in my family and in our background, and seeing a lot of the challenges that good friends of mine and good family members, have to face, the barriers that they face in their lives, I accepted the calling. And since then, I've been heavily involved in our inclusion with diversity efforts, and I'm very happy to be here today.
That's great. Thank you. And I think this first question will be kind of for all of you. I'll open it up. You've referenced, diversity and inclusion. And I think living in the world today, if you don't think about D&I or haven't at least heard about D&I and equity as well, I don't know how you've missed it. But each of you have kind of referenced it, but talk a little bit more, if you would, just about kind of your commitment to diversity and inclusion. And then we'll move into the accessibility piece in just a bit. And anyone can go first, no pressure, but I will call on you.
I can go first, I guess.
So yeah, you started this.
I think I kind of alluded to it a little bit. So personally, I was raised with the belief that you treat everyone with respect and you listen to understand everyone, and that you can always learn from someone else. And so for me, there's never been a question of, do I accept other people, or, do I challenge what someone else thinks? It's always been more of having thoughtful conversations with people about differences, and recognizing that the more you include someone and the more you bring them into your circle, the better your circle is and the more you know as a person. And so moving that into the professional space, there's obviously a very strong business case for DEI.
Yeah.
The more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment you have for individuals, the more productive your employees will be. And so we've just, we've really worked towards creating that culture. And it's just, I'm privileged to get to work in that culture and to have leadership who says, yes, go forth and do, in addition to what you do every day, for your paid job.
Yeah, that's great. Kim, Caitlin, anything you all would like to add?
I think along those lines, when you are an inclusive employer or an inclusive person, whatever your end goal is, whether it's a product or whether it's a project, you're going to be way more innovative when you have different perspectives and you're learning from that. So that's really where I value inclusion, is learning and growing in that space.
Great. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't mean to bring accessibility into this
No,
conversation.
we're moving in that direction.
already,
Please do.
But along the lines of what they're saying, something that I've found in my role at Blue Cross is that when we include people with disabilities and diverse ideas and life experiences, we are just so much better prepared to serve the members that we have. Like Blue Cross is an insurance company, so our number one goal is to always serve the members where they're at. And when we have an office building filled with a bunch of people without disabilities, or a bunch of people who are all of one ethnicity or sexual orientation or like political party or whatever, we are not able to truly understand the point at which each member is in their life, like journey. And so me coming into Blue Cross, I am a person with a visual disability. And so I was able to put an entirely new lens onto our web platforms that maybe people without visual disabilities never would have thought about. And it's always this light bulb moment where it's like, oh, that's why we do that, or that's why we need to do this. And so one of the best ways I found to be a truly inclusive and diverse workforce is to really make a point of embedding people with disabilities into every step of the process, not necessarily only in an accessibility role, but when we develop our web platforms, I believe that we should have disabled designers and developers and people in project management and people in every single aspect of the process.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that's my personal like soapbox.
I think it's a good soapbox
in
to
terms
have.
of accessibility. Like I'm always screaming it from the rooftops.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll get back to this as well, but I think that note of only putting diverse individuals into diversity or accessibility roles is a mistake, and they should permeate throughout an organization. And so thank you for that point. Ashley, this question's for you. So you talked about sort of extra work on top of your paid job, right? So you lead the ABLED group at Tennessee Valley Authority. So could you tell us a little bit more about the group and how your group and yourself as a leader are working to ensure that accessibility is a part of the DEI conversation?
Sure, I'll be happy to. So ABLED is one of our 8 employee resource groups, and ABLED stands for Awareness Benefiting Leaders and Employees About Disabilities. We really work to engage, equip, and elevate our employees about, in the workplace about disability matters. So we look at awareness, we look at resources, we look at support. Try to make sure our employees are aware of our accommodations process. Our leaders are aware of what our accommodations process is, how to access it, how to go through the process. And then we also focus on 3 kind of our C's, which are career, culture, and community. And so we do a lot of work with community advocates throughout this, throughout our 7-state region. And then we also do a lot of work raising awareness about disability culture. And then with careers, we really look at how can we, one, recruit disability candidates. And so we've done a lot of work there with the UTC Mosaic Program in the past year and a half. We currently have 4 interns from UTC Mosaic that work in our financial services organization, and it's just been a phenomenal experience. A couple of those are actually, one has moved to a full-time position.
Great.
And then we're going to have a couple others potentially moving in the next couple of, about 6-month time frame based on graduation. But so we really looked at how can we be more intentional in recruiting, and then how can we be more intentional in development of our current employees and making sure that we're giving them the resources to succeed. From an accessibility standpoint, of course, because we are a federal agency, we have organizations within TVA that focus on ensuring that we are meeting the accessibility requirements. So that primarily falls within our facilities management, IT, and HR organizations. But we do work with them. And so, for instance, the executive order on DEIA that was recently put out last year, ABLED was able to lean into that and kind of provide some feedback from an employee standpoint. We've really helped to drive our self-identification campaign, and really try to make it one inclusive, because if you've ever looked at the definitions of the disability, sometimes they're not really the nicest wording.
Right.
And so we've tried to make that more inclusive, and then also really just explain to individuals the benefit of self-identification, so that, like Caitlin was saying, then you're able to ensure you can get people engaged in projects and those types of things. And we can make sure that we have things in place that are helping drive that. And so with our diversity and inclusion team, they recently redid their strategic plan. And so part of their strategic plan does now include an equity and accessibility plan that they will be focusing on in the next couple of years to really make sure that we've brought those areas up to speed, so to speak.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. And I think that the self-identification piece is something that many people don't often think of. I think when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, obviously, if you're dealing with gender or race and ethnicity or other things, that visible diversity is interesting. But I've had conversations around the self-identification piece where the idea of passing. So as a member of the LGBTQ+ community, if I walk into a room, unless I self-identify, I am a cisgender white man, right? And that the assumption is that I'm also heterosexual. And so there's so much education that we have to do in advocacy, I think, around why it's important to self-identify. But there is that fear, I think, and that distrust of whether it be an organization or culture or the world in general about self-identifying. So thank you for the work that you're doing there. That's great. Caitlin, question for you. So obviously, as we've seen in your very own highlight reel before the panel and what you've talked about today.
I didn't know they were going to show that like right before I came.
Well, we wouldn't tell you that, or you wouldn't have come on stage, right? But your connection to this work is deeply personal, right? And so could you tell us a little bit more about, how you chose Chattanooga as home, as well as Blue Cross as your employer?
Absolutely. So yes, working in digital accessibility is highly personal to me, mostly because I'm blind. And digital accessibility is something that's on my mind every single day.
Right.
Every morning when my alarm on my phone goes off next to my bed, I think about digital accessibility. When I look at my phone and I have to turn my screen reader on and then read messages, when I go onto a web page and I'm trying to find out about something and then I tap it and realize that it's not configured for a screen reader.
Wow.
Digital accessibility is on my mind all day, every day. And especially right now during this time of COVID, where we're working from home. I'm personally a remote employee for Blue Cross.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a remote employee for Blue Cross. And so I work from home every single day. And so my screen reader is a huge part of my work and my daily life, and making sure that our technology internally at Blue Cross and externally are as accessible as possible are incredibly important to me. Why I came to Chattanooga and Blue Cross, honestly, the opportunity fell in my lap, and it was something that I just could not turn down. I have never worked for an employer who is so open and accepting. When I first interviewed for a contractor role at Blue Cross, I remember mentioning to the hiring manager, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm legally blind."
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Oh, okay. So what hours would you like to keep?" And that was it.
That was it.
It was never a conversation. It's never been an issue. And so when I had the opportunity to move over to full-time at Blue Cross, I jumped at the opportunity. And it's honestly taken me a while to get to accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
When I first came in as a contractor, I did work on an accessibility audit, and I gave a presentation and I did as much work as I could, but they didn't have any accessibility roles open at the time. And so I moved over to a marketing analyst job, and It was just a completely different job, had nothing to do with accessibility. And recently, in the past few months, the funding came through, and so I got to move over. And so it's been a very roundabout way of getting here
Mm-hmm.
and getting into an accessibility role, but I'm really happy that I did. Chattanooga is also awesome, and I basically moved here because Blue Cross is here.
Okay.
And I moved here solely for the job. but I absolutely love everything about it and where I live, and it's great. And I believe I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, and I would
Okay,
expound
yeah,
upon that a
sorry.
little bit. So you moved here for the job, which many of
Yes.
us have done, and I understand that. How has your experience in Chattanooga been as someone who has different abilities or sees differently than others? What has that been like for you?
I was very, very intentional when I moved to Chattanooga. I came here a few months before I officially moved here, and Blue Cross has this wonderful thing where they have a shuttle that will go through downtown Chattanooga and pick employees up and take them up to the campus
Yeah.
on Cameron Hill. And I went with my mom, and we stood at each shuttle stop and we looked around for an apartment building, and we chose one.
I love that.
And so that's kind of how I approached it. And I was initially moving to Chattanooga alone.
Yeah.
And so I had to be very intentional. It's like, can I walk to a grocery store? Can I walk to a pharmacy? Like, what is available near me? Can I get to work okay? And because I was so intentional with that, and I am privileged enough to be able to live in downtown, I've chosen a place downtown, and
Yeah.
it's been incredible. And I don't know if my experience would have been the same if I had lived in one of the suburbs surrounding Chattanooga. I don't know if I would have had the same access as I do right now, but in my current situation, I'm very, very lucky to have had a seamless transition into Chattanooga.
That's great. That's great. And I love Chattanooga, but it's good to hear from that perspective, obviously, as someone new to the city and somebody who obviously has different challenges than the rest of us. I appreciate that. So, Kim, next question is for you. So I know you very well. Obviously, you are very well connected in the community. You're a champion for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you're also an expert in talent development. And so working at EPB, could you tell me a little bit about how EPB is thinking about talent of the future and the workforce of the future and the ways that you are preparing yourself as an organization and as an employee group to be prepared for that workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the words that was mentioned earlier was intentional. And so taking an intentional approach at looking at all of our policies and our processes to make sure that they're inclusive for everyone, and different communities, constantly growing and learning about those communities. Because we only service the wonderful people of Chattanooga, we want to know as much as we can about our community and make sure that we are servicing them in the best way possible and what that means. So we're always looking at that aspect of improving those policies, ways that we can be more engaged. From a talent perspective, making sure that trainings and programs are available to everyone, every employee, and what does that need to look like for every employee. So for some, that would be, we have a learning platform that has captions on there or transcripts. If requests for certain accommodations are made, of course, we move to that. So we want to be very aware and intentional about that space. Research of talent of the future and what Gen Z is looking for and what that means from a generational diversity standpoint. And that's very important to us. So
Great. And Ashley, I think to tag along that a little bit, you mentioned UTC's Mosaic program.
Yes.
For those of us that don't know what that is, I know what it is,
Yeah.
but for those who may not know what it is, could you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the Mosaic program is a program that is designed to assist degree-seeking students on the autism spectrum with obtaining internships and then potentially full-time positions after they graduate with their degree at UTC. And so we actually I connected with Mosaic a very long time ago. It's been a very slow process. But about a year and a half ago, our financial services organization went through Mosaic. They met Michelle, they met Amy, had some great conversations, and we were able to be very intentional in finding positions that would fit students that had, degrees, that were seeking degrees that our financial services organization needed.
Great.
And so I think, back to what Kim said about being intentional, when you're looking at partnering with organizations like Mosaic, you can't just throw someone into a position that maybe already exists. And so what we had to do was look at, okay, what are the skill sets of the students that we're looking at? And then what are, some of the responsibilities that multiple people are doing that we could pull into an internship position. And like I said, it's been so successful. If you look out on our LinkedIn, one of our students actually did a video for World Autism Awareness Month, and he's actually coming on as a full-time employee soon. But it's just, our managers have told us they have learned so much, and they have grown as leaders by leading, students on the autism spectrum and working with the Mosaic program, because they do an amazing job of training your managers.
Yeah. So. That's wonderful. And I know that, as we heard from Dr. Quincy Jenkins earlier, Chat State also has amazing programs, but I think Mosaic is a unique example. And I think that goes back to the point that we were thinking about earlier around not only having sort of these token individuals in diversity or accessibility roles, having that permeate the organization, because I think as individuals that are diverse or that have different accessibility issues, you should be working with marketing, you should be working with HR, you should be working with talent development. And I think that when organizations don't look at that and they only place people in the diversity or accessibility categories, we're really missing out, right? And so I think that the ability to influence change is really powerful. And it's great to see that your finance organization has embraced that. And I know that at a previous employer, we worked with them, and it's wonderful. So I'll open this up for the group. I mean, we've talked a little bit about this with that program, but what are some of the other things to consider for each of you, or that you see your employer do when bringing accessibility into the conversation and thinking about workforce development and talent?
So I think for us, and for ABLED specifically, we have really tried to focus more on accessibility as a part of inclusion. And so we've been trying to, raise awareness to our workforce about very simple things. So, it could be, of course, we're all pretty much still teleworking and will be for the near future, actually completely future. So I cleaned out my desk on Monday. So it's
fresh. All right.
Yeah,
we'll
very
process
fresh.
it later.
It's very fresh. Yeah. I may have cried. No, But what we talk about is, not just thinking about the typical accommodations that you think of when you think of physical accommodations and then technological accommodations, but also thinking about things like, what is the lighting? Is the lighting putting off a sound so that could be distracting to someone with sensory issues? When you're in a WebEx, and, that was one of our challenges when we first moved to virtual, is our WebEx platform did not offer closed captioning because of the, version that we had to be on as a federal entity. And so, we had to encourage people to, one, have their cameras on for those who lip read so that they could actually hear. But then you had people who didn't want to have their cameras on because they weren't comfortable with their cameras on. So it's kind of a, raising awareness of this is why it's important, versus we don't really want your camera on so much so we can see you. It's so that other people can gather what's being said in the conversation. And then also, just different background sounds, different, it was mentioned earlier on this technological accessibility, when you're marking up contracts, don't use the colors that, typically are used, which is red. I mean, you redline a contract, right? So, thinking about those types of things versus the typical accommodations, which are handled by organizations outside of our ERG.
Yeah.
And then when we see issues, we help the employee raise those. So, if we see that there's a gap in the accommodation process, or if there is an accommodation issue somewhere, we try to help connect them to the right areas.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely. Blue Cross Blue Shield has also done a really great job, in my opinion, really highlighting the employees within our organization with various different abilities. We also have something very similar to what she was talking about in the ERG. Ours is called Valued Abilities.
Okay.
And it's been an incredibly helpful resource for a lot of people, not only those with disabilities, but one of my primary driving forces is like the idea of empathy. I really, really believe that the world would be a better place if we all just really developed our empathy just a little bit more. And something that Blue Cross did with the Valued Abilities ERG is really highlight the stories of the people we work with, as well as the people in our communities and our members, to really understand what the lives of other people are like and what struggles are in their lives, and really enabling our employees to connect with people on a different level. That wasn't necessarily the case beforehand.
Mhm.
And as a whole, I really appreciate that initiative at Blue Cross. And I feel that it's been incredibly useful and valuable, not only in my experience there, but in my fellow colleagues' experiences there.
Yeah, I think empathy is something, well, the world in general could use,
Oh, absolutely.
especially right now. But I think that when you have the ability to experience or at least imagine what somebody else has gone through, I think that that can really shift your perspective. My husband had ankle surgery in December, and he was non-weight bearing for 3 months.
Mhm.
And so we went from having a very active lifestyle to being in a boot and having crutches or a scooter and needing help, getting dressed and things like that. And it was incredibly humbling, I think, for him and just to watch that happen. And so, yeah, it changes everything, I think, if we're able to think about empathy. And so this question was going to be for later, but I think we're transitioning here right now a little bit. We've talked about, Ashley, some of your things. Like when I think about accessibility as someone who is not thinking about it all the time, like you are, Caitlin, I think, okay, like, is it physically accessible, right? Do we have ramps? Is there signage, things like that? But what are some of the things, you've alluded to some of them, that people don't think of when they're thinking about accessibility, like little things? You mentioned the redlining, but any other examples of that maybe I or others should think about more often? You can go first, Caitlin. Feel free. Yeah. I was like, jump in, dive in.
One of my favorite presentations that I've ever given at Blue Cross was on the importance of digital accessibility and really connecting our digital developers and designers and teams with the experiences of people with disabilities. In this presentation, I was able to walk the participants through the process of adjusting the settings on their computers to see a computer more like I do.
Mhm.
So I instructed them to go to the settings and switch their colors, because personally, I invert my colors on my computer 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Because it's the way that I can view the computer better. It's like I had them turn on their screen reader and I gave them a little lesson on how to use it and how to navigate and using the keyboards and all of these different things. And it was such an eye-opening moment for not only my supervisors, but my colleagues, and especially with things like redlining and the colors on the screen. They were able to truly understand, like when I come back to them with, hey, can you like explain like this little piece more? Or can you explain this because like somebody uses a color to highlight, or somebody replies to an email with a list of questions and they reply to the questions like in red font.
Oh yeah.
Which is very, very common.
I was like, someone did that to me yesterday.
I get it. I get it all the time, and I cannot see it to save my life. And it's something that people don't always understand until I have them switch the colors on their screen. And suddenly it's like, oh, that doesn't work. Like, thank you. It's this magical light bulb moment where it's like, oh my goodness, Caitlin, I understand now. Like, I get it. Like, I get that you can't see that. And I'm like, thank you. Thank you so much for understanding.
That's great.
And yeah, that's one of the primary little aha moments that have happened.
That's really cool. And I mean, and that goes back to your point about empathy, right? If we're willing to learn and take a moment to think differently than we do, it can be very life-changing. So that now I won't respond to anything in red ever again. Congratulations, you've changed my life.
For me, it's best if people like bold, underline, and maybe increase the font by 4.
Okay.
Like if they replied to an email like with answers, like that's how I see it best.
Okay, good to know.
I think one of the things, and this is actually, I had a very similar story to your husband with my empathy moment for disabilities. I had broke my foot and I was at TVA on the scooter with my boot, and you know, we don't have parking, so we're not lucky like Blue Cross. We didn't get to park right there, so you know, I had to like, you know, go down the brick sidewalk and all this stuff, and then try to get into the building. And our thing was our elevators. So I mean, we have like a bank of elevators, but they only have one button. And the one button is like way over here, right? So
Oh,
you push
wow.
this button, but then this elevator is the one that
Wind
opens.
sprint down to the other
And by the
end.
time you get down there with your little scooter, the door shut. And so that was kind of my first, why don't they think about this? And so I went to our facilities and I'm like, why do our doors shut so fast? And they're like, well, I mean, they're up to code. That's what they're supposed to be. And I'm
Right.
like, okay, but I can't make it from here to there, and it was simple stuff like that. Like even our cafeteria, how it's designed, if you're on a scooter, like trying to, navigate that with people in it. I mean, things may be up to code and they may be following, the required federal regulations and those types of things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're comfortable
Right.
and that they're inclusive. And so I think that's something that we really encourage people to really think about. If you're having a meeting, think about it this way. I mean, is it comfortable for people? Think about how you would want to be in this situation, how you would want to be comfortable, and then think about, is the invite, are your invitees going to be comfortable with this type of room setup or this type of thing? And that's kind of one of the things we've driven a lot. It's just really having that, put yourself in someone else's shoes for a moment and think about it.
Yeah. And not to go back to the empathy thing again, but empathy.
I love empathy. Let's always go back there.
I feel like it's the core of DE&I
Yes.
work, especially from a talent development side with training and doing inclusion trainings. You have to really emphasize, okay, go into this with this open mind and this empathy to learn about, different aspects of your community or different members of your community. And that's how these types of conversations come about, with connecting to facilities or connecting with, colleagues and things like that. So empathy, I think, is really the core piece of that.
I think empathy, we're establishing that's what we're all going to take home, right? That's our goal. Okay. So Caitlin, I'll start with you for this question, and then I would love to hear from Ashley and Kim as well. So, we've talked a little bit about choosing Blue Cross, coming to live in Chattanooga, but you've obviously traveled, as we saw in the video. What are some other communities or other things that are happening in other communities that are really best practices, or that you've seen as like shining examples of accessible places?
That is an excellent question. And I feel like as a society in general, we're definitely at a point where accessibility is coming more to the forefront of people's minds, and everyone is working on it. Do I think that anyone is officially there? If they are, I've never been there. But I can definitely take away a lot of aspects of various places I've been as kind of like unexpectedly remarkable.
Okay.
I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Republic of Panama. And one thing about Panama is that a lot of people have cars, but honestly, where I was, basically no one had a car. And we were out in the middle of nowhere. So we were out in the interior, the countryside of Panama. And it was incredible, because if I think of here in the States, if I want to get to my family in Rome, Georgia, which is like, I think it would be more or less like, a good comparison to where I was in Panama, that would never, ever, ever, ever happen without a car.
Right.
You can't do it. Like that, it's impossible. Whereas in Panama, they had a series of public transportation and private transportation and buses that would come by your house every like 3 to 4 hours. Like it wasn't very consistent, and it wasn't very like, I don't know. It wasn't very, you would have to wait at a bus stop for a long time.
Right.
But at the end of the day, in Panama, you can get basically anywhere on public transportation.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you live out in the middle of nowhere or you live in a big city, and you might have to take 4 buses and transfer to get to where you need to go, but there is a way to do it. And I find that absolutely remarkable. And I would love to see a better public transportation system here in the States. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Right. That's an infrastructure problem we probably can't
Like,
solve today.
Like I need to go up to DC and talk to them about that. But
Yeah.
It was a remarkable thing about that particular area of the world, that no one had cars, and so they figured out a way around it.
Yeah.
And it was a series of buses that truly worked.
That's
it was
great.
convoluted, and it was confusing, and it was a little strange. You would often ride with chickens, and like it was a little strange, but at the end of the day, it worked.
Okay, that's great. And yeah, I definitely would not. That shows my own bias, right? I wouldn't have thought of Panama as a good example of public transportation. So that's really cool. And what about, I mean, anything from you, Ashley or Kim? I mean, whether it could be other companies that are doing cool work. I mean, we have 3 of our largest employers obviously on stage with us today, but any other shining examples? And it's okay if you don't, we can move on.
Yeah, I can't really think of any shining examples. I agree with Caitlin. I think accessibility has become more of a, I want to say, hot topic. I mean, more, you're hearing it talked about more. And, you know, even like with our executive order, it wasn't just diversity, equity, and inclusion. It also incorporated accessibility, and which, you know, is driving more companies to think more about accessibility. But I can't think of anyone just right now off the top of my head that is just absolutely, you know, at the top of the, you know, beyond 5 stars or something like that.
No problem.
Yeah, I think one of the great parts of Chattanooga is that we have a very collaborative community, especially among the different business partners. And so it's really great to see different businesses reaching out and saying, hey, TVA, what are you all doing for, you know, ability, or what are you doing Blue Cross, and collaborate that way. Even though we're all in different industries in some ways, I think that is a really great part of Chattanooga that not a lot of cities may have that.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and I think, I mean, if you look at the recognition that our local companies get in accessibility, excuse me, inclusion and equity work every year, from our large companies to our small ones, it's very obvious we have a committee or a community that is committed to that and to diversity and inclusion. So, so with that question, I'm going a little bit off script here. They're going to freak out because some of the questions beforehand, they're like, no, what's he doing? But obviously, creating culture and creating a culture that is inclusive and just changing the culture that exists are 2 kind of different things, right? So for people that are listening or that are in the audience, let's say that you don't work at a huge organization that has entire teams devoted to this, and we have either a startup or a small mom and pop shop that wants to be more inclusive, or whatever it may look like. What's a piece of advice that you would give them? And anyone can start.
I would go back to the advice that I had given at the top of this conversation. It's that it's so important to try your best, not necessarily like you don't have to be 5 stars right out the gate, but try your best to include the voices and experiences of various types of people, whether it be people from the LGBT community or people with disabilities or different races or ethnicities, immigration status. Just try to include as many voices into the conversation from the start as you possibly can, because it's so much easier to build like a strong foundation and a strong house than it is to go back and like start patching up like a weak house.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense.
It's so much easier to just do it right from the start, as opposed to like going back and trying to fix all of this work that you've done. And so if diversity and inclusion and equity are really truly important to you, and I think, as she said, there's a business value for that. Like right now in the world we live in right now, people, when they look for products and they look for companies to support, they're thinking about diversity and inclusion. They want to be represented in the places where they patronize.
Right.
And so if it's important to you, it should be important from the very start.
That's great. Okay. Kim, Ashley?
Well, I think you mentioned that people are looking for employers who are valuing diversity and inclusion, and that's definitely something we've seen in our generational research with Gen Z coming into the workplace. That is a huge question. What are you doing for inclusion? You know, what are you doing to continue to grow your employees in that space? So I think that's a huge piece. For, you know, going back to your question about startups or smaller companies, you know, I think one of the best aspects is just networking and getting to know different people in the community, getting on LinkedIn and saying, hey, Miles, we've never met, like, but I noticed you work in, you know, diversity and inclusion. Like, would you be willing to get a cup of coffee or talk?
I think that's actually how we met. Go ahead.
Just putting that plug in there. It works. But yeah, so I think, you know, not being afraid to connect and network in that sense to learn about different communities.
Great.
Yeah. And I think for me, on top of those things, your actions have to match your words.
Absolutely.
So you can't say that you want to have, a company that values diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but then not have the structure that shows that you value those things, and not be, intentionally recruiting diverse candidates, and not be intentionally putting stuff in place to make sure that your employees can bring 100% of themselves to work every single day. And you have to make sure that if there are issues, that those issues are addressed, and that it's, it's visible that those things happen, because they will happen.
Yeah.
And if you don't address them, then that takes away your words, and it shows that, well, you say you value it, but you may not really value it as much as you say you do.
Yeah, I think that commitment to the follow through, right? I mean, I think we've seen him, especially in the past few years, because of sort of some of the unrest that we've seen as a nation. I mean, I think we had a lot of communities and companies emerge and say, well, we have a diversity statement on our website, so we're killing it, right? It's like, no, it is that commitment and that follow through. And I think also like an openness to asking questions. I know that at least for me as an individual, I've had people that are scared to ask about being a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And that's how we learn, Kim, I think to your point, me asking Caitlin questions, like we're walking out here, like, do you want to grab my shoulder? What's the best way that we can get out here? Right. Like, and I was nervous asking that, but I think being open and realizing that we are all human. And it's a shocking thing that when you can show up to work as your full self, you perform better and the company performs better. And I think that ROI and that business case for diversity and inclusion, I mean, on top of it just being the right thing to do, it really can improve productivity, it can improve culture and so many of those things. And I think we're moving there, but it is definitely going to take some time. So anything else on that? I know that's a one other thing I would add to is that I think for small companies, I think it is daunting, right? I think if you have a smaller organization or you're a startup or an entrepreneur, you often don't know where to start, because I think the DEIA conversation is so large that it seems really, really daunting. But I think that oftentimes those people in those organizations are best poised to, Caitlin, to your point, to build a strong foundation, because you don't have huge processes to go through. You don't have, 80 board of directors that are breathing down your throat or whatever it may be. I mean, you're able to really, really do the work up front and build that foundation so that you're not going back and patching things up later. And I'm also going to be using that analogy forever now. So
it's also important to continue to stay up to date with what is happening in the field, because DEI 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago is completely different than it is today.
Yeah.
And in accessibility, the World Wide Web Consortium is changing their guidance every few years. And so all of these mandates and like best practices are constantly being changed. And so I think it is a best practice to have an entire team dedicated to staying up to date with those kinds of things, because it's almost a full-time job to keep up to date with it.
Right. Yeah. Well, so on that note, I mean, obviously we've talked about, accessibility emerging as a priority. We've seen, very rightfully so, there's been a huge focus in our country and the world on race and ethnicity and systemic racism. So working in this space and living in and thinking about accessibility, thinking about diversity and inclusion often, what are some things that you see coming down the pipeline as like next big things, next big focus areas, or things that you hope are a part of that? Caitlin, you go ahead.
So I was actually reading about the innovations that are currently being made in the virtual reality space.
Okay.
Everybody's talking about this Web3 that's happening, and how sooner or later we're all going to be wearing VR goggles to go to work every day.
That's terrifying.
And it is terrifying. And one of the very first things that I think about is, how on earth will that work for me?
Oh my gosh.
How is that going to work?
Yeah.
And so it's actually starting to become a conversation in the accessibility space, and people are starting to work on how exactly is that space, that workspace, going to function for people with disabilities, especially people with visual disabilities, because I don't know how that's going to work. We don't know yet, but I'm very excited to find out, and I'm keeping a very close eye on it.
Yeah. Okay.
I think for me, DE&I work is everyone's responsibility in a way. And I think that some companies do have inclusion and diversity teams dedicated to that in their professional role, but we really all do have a role to play with working, in those granular levels of your day to day, even if that's not your professional title. Like, that is a responsibility we all have to our community and to our friends and our colleagues. So
Yeah, great.
And I think for me, the more discussions on intersectionality and
Yes.
really people understanding that no one person is a member of one affinity group. And, really having those intentional conversations about how it can be different for different groups. But at the end of the day, that's a similarity that you have. And so it's something we've started talking about more. But I really think based on the first conversations, there's a lot of confusion about intersectionality. And so I really look forward to having those discussions more and really, having that open up. And then the other thing, for me personally, and something that has become very important to us and ABLED over the past 2 years is having, more crucial conversations about mental health. And really removing the stigma of a mental health diagnosis. I think that we recognize that it's so important, but we need to keep pushing that in the DEI space because I think it's going to become more critical, more, I think at one point it will probably become one of your top disability diagnoses.
Yes, absolutely. We've had that shared experience, right? We've lived through a global pandemic and we've seen cases of depression and anxiety. I've experienced personally, that feeling. And I think there is such a stigma around that. And I think that will continue to emerge. And I think that conversation needs to change, much like it does around accessibility, because I think that we are moving in that direction. And as a millennial, right, we all have mental health diagnoses, right? Like that's what we get made fun of for. So we're moving in that direction. So we might as well embrace it. But it is so important and so true. And I think I have a question for you all, and you kind of led me here. What do you feel is the importance of allies in this work? And I know what that means for me, but I'm curious to hear from you all. What is an ally to you, and what's the importance of them? Kim, how about you?
I think allyship is super important because it goes back to empathy. But I think, you need those allies to help advocate in spaces where people may not be able to do so, or, just the allyship piece and component is so important for moving things forward, for making, new policies, new processes, paving that way. We're all in it together. And I think that's really where allyship for me plays a huge role in that space.
Great. Kaylin, Ashley?
I don't really have anything to add to that. It's critical. It's critical for every affinity group. There are some that having allies is even more imperative. The LGBTQIA community having allies, I will tell you, our Spectrum employee resource group, the majority of our members are allies.
That's true.
But that's amazing. It's amazing that many people within our organization have stepped up and said, hey, we support you.
Right.
But we see it in all of our ERGs. ABLED, 7.6% of our population has self-identified with a disability. We have almost 10,000 employees. So obviously I don't have all 7.6% of those people in my employee resource group. It is primarily allied, or it is people who have family members with disabilities or have friends with disabilities, and they are trying to find ways to support and raise awareness and be that ally and be that advocate.
That's great.
At some point, I truly believe that everyone is going to be touched in some way, by a disability, whether it's a close family member or yourself. Like, it's a really scary thought, and I know people don't like it, but every human is one really bad car accident away from being from having a disability. And while you may not have a disability right now, as some of the previous speakers have said, like, most of people over the age of 65 identify as having one or more disabilities. And so it's very likely that sometime in your life, this is going to affect you. And so it's important to be an ally, because you just never know when it might be you.
Yeah.
And when it's you, you're going to want people in your corner. You're going to want people by your side to like lend a hand or just an ear or anything. And It's just it's so important.
It is. And I think, that, Kim, you mentioned, and Ashley, you mentioned the LGBT community. I think when we use the word ally, that's typically what we think of, right? But I think that I've even learned the way that we show up as allies, the way that I as a man show up for women as an ally, the way that I as a white person show up for my friends of color as an ally, that is so powerful. And I think that, the misconception of that I'm the only one that should be using my voice for that community, right? If I belong to it, I'm the only one that can speak to it. But I mean, even just right, like biologically, like there are more people that aren't like me than there are. And so I think, Caitlin, that importance of realizing that it could be you, and you do know someone that has been impacted by either a disability or whatever other sort of affinity group we're talking about, is so powerful. And I think the way that we are brave enough to show up, because I think that having been in a space where it felt like I was the only one advocating for whatever it was, if you have someone who comes along beside you and says, I'm here, you are not alone, whatever the reason they do that or whatever you're experiencing, the way that it makes you feel and the way that it lends itself to you using your voice differently is so powerful. And so I think that's great. And Caitlin, this is a little bit of a more personal question. I hope that you're okay with me asking this, but I mean, you've had a unique experience in that your disability emerged at a later on in life. You weren't necessarily born with vision loss. And so what was that transition like for you? I mean, and if it's okay, you don't have to only go as deep as you want, but I'm curious about your experience.
So I have a condition called Conrad dystrophy, and it was something that I was born with. However, it did not start affecting me until I was in high school, and doctors couldn't figure out what it was until I was in college. But it's been a very difficult process, and I am very fortunate in that it was very gradual.
Yeah.
So I initially started noticing that colors weren't quite the same, and then I slowly noticed that things just kind of started vanishing in my visual field. And it was a very, very slow process. The biggest transition, the biggest shock that has ever happened was them taking away my driver's license.
Wow.
Because they won't let blind people drive.
Right.
I've tried to convince them, but they just won't let me.
Right.
I really put effort into convincing them.
I believe you. I do.
It hasn't happened. I'm waiting for those autonomous vehicles.
Okay.
But that was the biggest shock, and it happened at a time when I was living in Atlanta and I had lots of access to public transit.
Right.
And so gladly it wasn't that big of a deal. The first thing my doctor ever said to me about my vision was like, hey, so what do you want to do with your life? And I said, I want to join the Peace Corps. And he was like, you can't do that.
Right.
You're going blind. You can't do that. You can't just go traipsing through the jungle. And I proved him wrong. And so I'm pretty proud of that.
That's awesome.
And all I can say about the process is that it was very gradual, and I was able to adjust as it happened. So as I started losing more and more vision, I had time to adjust to each new step.
Right.
So suddenly computers were really difficult to see, and I was squinting a lot. And so I was like, oh wait, look, I can change the colors. And that happened. And I realized that I couldn't really see my phone. And so I taught myself how to use voiceover on my phone. And it's been just this slowly graduating. That didn't make any sense. This very gradual process over a period of time. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm sure it would have been a lot more difficult if, like so many people, I lost my vision overnight.
Yeah.
But that's not how it happened. And it would have also been, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to go through the public school system with vision loss.
Right.
Maybe I would be a little more skilled at my assistive technology now, but I don't know how that would have been. And I'm very grateful that I was given the space and time to do it at my own pace. And I'm sorry, I've gotten a little
No, you're doing great.
circular in my storytelling.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And thank you for being so vulnerable. I know that was anyway, I appreciate that. And so we have about 5 minutes left. And so I would love, as sort of we move into the next phase of the program, any parting words or words of advice for someone who's trying to think more inclusively, think about accessibility more, and think through that lens every day, because we make mistakes, right? Yesterday, I'll tell on myself, right? I was in this group meeting and I heard one of the people next to me, she was speaking in what I thought was a very apparent German accent. And so I was like, oh, this is really neat. Like you obviously like are from somewhere else, and I'm assuming it's Germany because I'm American and I hear an accent and I'm wrong. And so I was like, oh, well, my husband's taking German. And she looked at me, she was like, I'm Dutch. And I was like, neat. Okay, those are not the same things. So you make mistakes, right? But what ended up happening is I ended up having a wonderful conversation with this woman about where she was from and her experience in coming to America and being, speaking multiple languages and having English not be her first language. So we're gonna screw up, right? But for anybody who's trying to be more inclusive, who's trying to be more equitable in the way they view the world, what would be one piece of advice that you would give them as an individual? You can go first, Kelly. Yeah.
I just like talking.
We like when you talk. That's why you're on a panel.
I would definitely say, I know it can be intimidating sometimes to reach out to people with disabilities. I know I walk around with my cane and it seems very difficult to approach me and talk to me. And I get that. I totally understand. However, I really feel that getting to know and building relationships with people with disabilities and people of other like affinity groups, as you use, I love that word, from different affinity groups is the best way to learn about other people's perspectives and journeys. Yeah. Because reading about something in books and reading articles are all great and that's wonderful and like keep doing that. But the one-on-one connection with a human being, learning about their experiences and their triumphs and struggles and everything in between, there's just no substitution for it.
Thanks, Caitlin. Kim?
Yeah, I think when you connect with people like that one-on-one and you have that organic conversation, it's great reading books, like you said, and going through all that. But you have an opportunity as the conversation changes to learn more, to ask those questions that are, timely to the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think the conversation is so important. I would add to that for yourself personally, you have to become aware of your implicit biases.
Absolutely.
And so, there's a lot of tools and techniques. I think the Harvard Business School has on their website some implicit bias tests that you can take that are based on gender, race, age. I mean, they're based on so many different things, take those, start recognizing where your biases are, because I think once you know where your biases are, it makes having those conversations so much easier. Because you're more aware of yourself as an individual.
Thank you. And I think I would just echo, Caitlin, Kim, you've all mentioned this. I think relationships change everything. And I think that when we surround ourselves only with people that look or think or believe like we do, we're not going to change, right? And so I think that it can be daunting, Caitlin, to your point, to approach someone who may be different than you. But I think that is where I'm a former therapist, so I obviously believe in relationships, but I think that there's so much power in that relationship and that empathy, and that's how we learn and grow. So ladies, thank you all so much for being here. Let's all give them